I'm really delighted to say that a man that I met in Tromsø last May is with us today. He's got some fantastic experiences to share. He's Urmas Paet MEP, Chair of the European Parliament Arctic Friendship Group. And please give him a big round of applause. Welcome. Lovely to see you.
Hello and good afternoon, dear friends and colleagues, and I'm really happy to be here in Scotland, as Scotland is to Arctic almost as close as is my home country, Estonia, so that I feel very much at home here. Let me start with this, that I also admire and enjoy very much Scottish Arctic strategy, because it is really concrete, really to the substance, which unfortunately it's not always the case with this kind of strategy documents, including different Arctic policies, from different countries. Yes, it's true that I established a few years ago in the European Parliament so-called Arctic Friendship Group. And the main reason why I did this was that, I understood that there is not enough knowledge, not enough attention in the European structures, including in the European Parliament, on Arctic issues and Arctic developments. Because only maybe 5-6 years ago, when I wrote my first Arctic report in the European Parliament, then I still had to struggle with some governments and also some people from the European Commission who, for example, didn't want to see in the European Parliament's Arctic policy paper or Arctic report anything about security and some other, modern challenges and issues. Because decades and decades we all had very nice and at that time well-functioning understanding that, of course, Arctic is a low-tension area and nothing really serious, nothing like on the basis of conflict can happen in Arctic area. But unfortunately, what we have also seen in Arctic area during last years is that because of climate change, because of physical changes in many parts of Arctic, we, of course, notice very rapid increase of interest towards Arctic in many countries. And not all of this interest is, friendly or Arctic supportive. We would say that today Arctic is strategically one of the hotspots in the world. And one of the reasons is, of course, the physical changes because of climate change, which increases the access to the natural resources, which increases accessibility for international maritime traffic, new possible shipping routes, trade routes, and so on. And it, of course, also automatically means that the competition between world superpowers is very rapidly increasing. We have in Arctic already very serious representation of superpowers. We have United States, we have the European Union, we have Russia, we have Canada, even China calls itself as near Arctic country. And of course China, as we all know, has lots of plans together with Russia what concerns Arctic. And I have my subjective doubts that not all of this agenda is about, environment, is about scientific research and, the positive developments and agenda in Arctic. So it means that the struggle and competition, also geopolitical one, arrived in Arctic area. We also noticed before the new wave of Russian aggression in Ukraine started last February, that also more and more countries here in Europe, but also, well, globally, wanted to get closer to the Arctic Council, which is a very unique organization. We have already lots of observers. We have lots of candidates for observers which are not geographically very close to Arctic. So it reflects clearly how interesting is Arctic today for more and more capitals and power centers in the world. But when we speak about security environment, then of course the Arctic Council in the world is most probably the only international organization which, because of Russian aggression against Ukraine, is basically paralyzed. Because cooperation, of course, with Russia under these circumstances is not an option, it's not continuing, so that all other members of Arctic Council, all other democratic members of Arctic Council, of course, have now to find the way how to move forward with cooperation in Arctic area. But of course, Russia is present in Arctic, has huge interests what concerns raw materials, what also concerns military and security build-up in the region, so that if there are people who think that, well, maybe this war in Ukraine, this Russian aggression against Ukraine is just local or regional catastrophe, but it's not true. We all see that this war and this Russian action influences more or less everything in Europe. It's also about business relations, it's also about economy, it's, well, of course, not talking about situation of human rights and breaking international law, but the influence is everywhere. We even see that, I really hope that it now happens in very foreseeable future, that two more Arctic nations, Finland and Sweden, will join NATO. So it means that also the security space in Arctic will change, and will change rapidly. De facto, it already changed, of course. But if Finland and Sweden will join, then it also changes, well, legally and also in practical security point of view. And the only reason why Finns and Swedes changed their minds is, of course, Russian aggression against Ukraine and all other affairs which came out from this horrible aggression and war. Russian build-up in their military build-up in their Arctic, of course, is nothing new. It lasted already last 10, 15 years, huge investments into Russian military presence in their Arctic. And of course, always the question mark has been, why? If also Russians and everybody else, they all have spoken that well, Arctic is always and must stay as low tension area, then why to spend huge amount of resources and money to increase tremendously, well, military presence in this low conflict or low tension area. But the fact is that yes, Russia has invested into Arctic from military point of view, well, huge sums of money already more than a decade. And also these days, when it takes lots of Russian resources to continue war against Ukraine, but still, most of Russian military presence in Arctic is the same. They didn't touch it, starting with nuclear submarines or other military presence in Arctic area. Another, of course, also security-related issue is energy. And energy, of course, is the sphere where Arctic has potentially a lot to offer to Europe. Because one of the problems Europe has faced, of course, was and partly still is, that we are too much dependent on third countries what concerns energy. It was the case with Russia, the gas pipelines, and of course this is, well, another very sad story that even after 2014, when Russia already attacked Ukraine and started the war against Ukraine, 2014, only after it, Nord Stream 2 was built, so that no lessons learned at all. And the energy dependency of Europe was simply increased. So that during last year, of course, there have been lots of changes what concerns energy and energy security in Europe. There are new partners in Gulf countries and North Africa and so on and so on. But of course, the most secure energy supply is European energy and preferably European renewable energy. And this is, of course, the issue where Arctic area can offer a lot. When we speak about renewables, when we speak about hydro, about wind, but here, of course, one of the critical issues is connections. If even Nordic countries, including Scotland, can produce more and more renewable energy, then, of course, it's an important issue how this energy will be transported to other European countries. So that I come from Estonia. We have quite nearby in northern part of Norway and Sweden and Finland, quite nice energy production already these days, but still the price difference of electricity between Estonia and our northern neighbors may be many, many times. And the reason is that there is lack of adequate connections. So that, and it of course also should be one of the priorities these days for the European Union, including European Parliament, European Commission, to decide how to efficiently support building new energy connections from northern part of Europe to the rest of Europe. So that in this regard, of course, energy these days is not only the issue of convenient consumption and price, but it is clearly also a security issue. As we have also seen that the same Russia has used and still is using also energy supply as one of the weapons. We see these days what happens in Moldova, for example, where basically Russia started hybrid war against Moldova, and one of the parties again energy export and the price and cuts and so on and so on. So that if we really like to also increase the energy security of Europe, then I see that the most important issue is, of course, Nordic and Arctic areas, which in this sense can increase tremendously also energy security for all European countries. Then in Arctic, of course, we have also lots of other ideas, like the idea which Russia and also China promoted before, a new wave of aggression against Ukraine. It is this so-called northern route, sea route between Pacific Ocean and Atlantic. I know that also our Norwegian and northern Norwegian friends have been very much interested in, and also some others. But of course it's clear that as long as in Russia remains the same political regime, then I don't see any real perspective for this kind of new developments, because simply the partnership with this kind of regime is impossible. So that yes, there are very ambitious plans also in Arctic and related to Arctic, but they simply will not happen because of the same reasons. The organizers told me that I have only 10 minutes for my starting monologue. I guess I exhausted this time, so that I only managed to touch few, for me, and I guess also for Europe, the most important things related to Arctic as outcome of climate change. Of course, we all know, and I didn't have to spend time on the real basics, which is the same climate change and the physical changes, and what will happen as consequence, not only for geopolitical relations and geopolitical image, but of course also to the people on the ground it is absolutely important, and that's why, of course, all the disputes and discussions which are going on in all Arctic countries, when we even speak about energy, all those settlements, of course, should be somewhere, and in this regard, of course, the local population and their opinion is also very relevant, so that it's always about discussions and disputes. But as I said, the understanding what Arctic is and what is the potential of Arctic changed during last few years very, very rapidly. Because when I did together with my colleagues in the European Parliament last Arctic report, it was 2 years ago, even before Russia attacked once again Ukraine, then already I didn't have to explain why once again we have to write and speak about security and all other changes in Arctic environment. So that once again, thank you for listening my starting monologue. I can repeat here, which I also said previously, that I guess that looking at all developments all around the world, I still think that Arctic has very huge potential, because it's simply the land of people with very strong common sense and very practical and pragmatic approach, as we also see from the Scottish Arctic strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. Do stay with us. Just want to know if anybody has any questions they'd like to put to Urmas, given his obvious experience at the European Union. There's a question just in the middle at the back.
Thank you very much. The question is, within the EU Arctic Friendship Group, what role do indigenous peoples, specifically Sami, play? And also in the creation of the EU Arctic policy? Thank you.
Well, in the friendship group, the only people who play the role are members of the European Parliament. So that if there are or will be representatives also from the indigenous areas of Arctic, then of course very welcome to join. But what concerns our working agenda, then of course this issue plays very prominent role. Because as I said, when we even speak about all these ambitious and interesting developments about energy or infrastructure and investments into Arctic area, then of course there are people all around. So it means that the positions of indigenous people from the area is absolutely important. Second issue is that when I also visited different events of indigenous people, then there always has been very strong criticism against, how to say, their own governments. Governments in Oslo, in Stockholm, in Helsinki. Which is somewhat, in this sense, surprising, because I guess that in the European Union structures, people think that, well, they're all the same. So that, and all this criticism coming against their own politicians and capitals, it is surprising. But again, as I said, that everything good can only happen when we have dialogue and disputes, then of course. I guess that representatives of indigenous people from Arctic, it's absolute must to find all these balance points which are very much needed in this very rapidly changing environment. And also if we look at, as I described, few moments, but there are many others, also the needs of their own countries, but also Europe as such. So the short answer to your question is that yes, indigenous people are I would say very, very close in communication.
You do have this formal annual dialogue, don't you, with indigenous people of the European Arctics. What is that exactly, and what form does it take?
Well, European Commission, of course, also has this dialogue, not that much European Parliament. But European Parliament representatives have been during last years also, as I said, invited to important meetings of Sami people and others from the region. But of course, because part of the Arctic is also the European Union. And when we speak about the European Union decisions, including budget decisions, then of course it has direct impact also there, for example, Finland and Sweden and partly Denmark, which are in the European Union. So that of course there is very practical and close link. But another issue, and this is even, I would say, more difficult, is the issue which is very important for the European Union, of course, is human rights issue. And when we speak Arctic and indigenous people in Arctic as such, then we have still very harsh violations of human rights all around the globe. So that yes, it's easier for us to manage if there are conflict situations maybe in the EU countries. But look at the indigenous people's situation in Russia, for example. So that it is a very sad story. But again, it should be under the European Union and human rights organizations' attention what is going on with indigenous people, for example, in Russia. The last very tragic example is that when Russia had last wave of mobilization to get the people whom they wanted to send to Ukraine to die, then they took village by village also indigenous people, and mainly them. They didn't touch that much St. Petersburg or Moscow or big cities, no. They concentrated on smaller villages, smaller towns, and took more or less everybody. And it very much hurts also, of course, the situation, which is anyway bad, of indigenous people in Russia as well.
Is there another question from the floor? I just want to ask you, we're talking about the geopolitical situation, and there is still a concern that because of it, and this stress on energy security, there will be, and there is more gas exploration and extraction. Are you concerned that it will slow down the transition to renewable?
No, I don't, because I guess the mindset, at least in Europe, is already so that I guess it's absolute majority of people who today already understand that the future of energy is renewable one. But it's only Europe. So that also in the European Parliament, when we, again, prepared last reports on Arctic, then always there has been discussion. I guess our friends in Norway know it very well. On the one hand, we speak about energy security, and these days, of course, Norwegian gas is very important to increase energy security of Europe. But on the other hand, of course, there is a very strong understanding that, there should be a complete ban for exploring and drilling gas and oil in Arctic waters. But here is this problem that even European Parliament or any other European institution makes this kind of decision, then of course, European organization and European countries have to obey, and European businesses. But Arctic is the whole. At the same time, sorry, but Russians, Chinese, and maybe even Americans, they don't care what the European Parliament decides. So that again, the impact to the Arctic as such, even potential, is very limited, but damage to Europe will be very strong. Because even today, maybe I'm not too objective, but my feeling is that, for example, Norwegian energy companies are much more secure, also vis-à-vis environment in this regard, than Russian ones or Chinese ones or any other ones who also very actively are trying to explore and then start new places in Arctic to get gas and oil, because still, as I know, around 30% of so far unused gas is in Arctic in the world. And of course, the interest is huge.
Mm-hmm. So a question there, just in the middle. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I had a quick question about whether standing or sitting was appropriate. But I want to thank you for your speech. I learned a lot. And I just wanted to return to a topic of indigenous issues in the Arctic relating to Europe. And this time I actually wanted to ask about your relations, and specifically with Denmark and Greenland as a territory of Denmark. So the Inuit of Greenlandic, the Galalaq, linguistically and culturally are perhaps more North American Inuit than European. But because Greenland exists as a territory of Denmark, they then become a part of Europe. So I'm curious about how you treat sort of the Greenland territory as something that is geographically North American, and the people there are perhaps more culturally North American Inuit, but as something that is politically European.
Well, from legal point of view, it is more or less clear. Denmark is part of the European Union, Greenland is not. So that in this regard, it is quite, I would say, strange situation for the EU, but that's life. So that from practical point of view, I hope that finally also the representation of the European Union, European Commission starts working in Nuuk, in Greenland. Because we know that there is already years and years American consulate, which is bigger than the foreign ministry of Greenland. We see there time to time, increasing and then maybe a bit decreasing, quite massive interest from China. We have read in the newspapers that former President Trump wanted to buy Greenland. So it means that the interest is again rapidly increasing, of course, on Greenland. And the reason is the same what I described in my starting monologue. The changed security environment, the changed, of course, also business environment, including raw materials and so on. So that the European or European Union approach to Greenland, in this sense, should be, as it should be, of course, with every other place in the world. Respect to the local community, of course, respect to the international law and human rights. It is, yes, specific, because I described this quite confusion for many people that, well, Denmark is in, but Greenland is not. But I guess we can manage. So that I think that that also for Greenland and for Greenlanders, very close contact and cooperation with the European Union is very useful. Because the European Union, if I compare with China, or with Americans, or with some others, European Union has no selfish agenda with Greenland. And that's why I think that also for Greenland and for Greenlandic perspective, the close relationship with European Union is only beneficial.
Okay, thank you. Is there another question? You've had one question, but okay, you can have another one, and then that would be the that would be the last one. But thank you.
If no one else wants to ask, then I can ask.
Yes.
So you spoke about the northern route, and I wondered about your opinion of the Chinese Silk Route, and what measurements within the EU are taken for this. As you understand, of course, China is taking up quite a few ports across Europe and wanting to establish that strong connection there. But you seem to be very skeptical, from my understanding, of Chinese.
Well, I'm not skeptical, I'm just objective. I just look what authoritarian regimes do in the world. And also with China, I guess for Europe it would be very wise to have lessons learned. Let's look at Africa, let's look at some Latin American countries, some Asian countries, even some European countries. I mean some from the Western Balkans, where people initially, well, were very naive and were thinking that in huge totalitarian or authoritarian regimes, business and politics and security interests are very much separate. They are not. They're very much united. So that finally, I'm glad that also in Europe, a few years ago, we had discussion if Chinese Huawei company can build 5G systems. Although we had and have our own. We have Nokia in Finland, we have Ericsson in Sweden, which also can do easily the same. But still, people were seriously discussing that, well, maybe Chinese is better because it's cheaper. Again, initially they didn't look at all other risks related to this. But of course, this dispute finally ended in the way which was completely logical, that these days when globally we see not anymore only competition, but also conflict between democracies and authoritarian, totalitarian regimes, then there are spheres where we should keep our own strategic interests and also strategic investments. So that with telecommunications, I guess that now finally we managed to settle the right attitude. But yes, you're right that, well, there is German government who just, sold part of Hamburg harbor to Chinese and so on. So that I guess that this kind of huge physical infrastructure has also very important strategic value. And that's why I think that that's still here in Europe, or together with democratic partners in the world, we still have enough resources to make strategic investments on our own and not to increase the level of risks. I spoke about Russia. It is also a clear example. Yes, 10 years ago and even less, lots of important politicians said that, well, it is Europe's interest to get endless flow of cheap gas from Russia because it's in our, business interests. Now we see what was the price of this endless flow of cheap gas. And in this sense, Chinese regime is not different. It's huge authoritarian power where business and politics is very strongly mixed. And I guess always all decision makers in Europe have to keep it in mind every time they analyze that if we should sell or let invest into this or that also important physical object, if it will have strategic value or not. So that I guess this should be also the basis when we speak about possible future Chinese investments, but not only Chinese investments of all other third, I stress, authoritarian regimes in our neighborhood.
Thank you so much, Urmas. It's been great to have you here talking to us about all these very important strategic aspects. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
And welcome to Abu Dhabi. So thank you.